like, or remain seated. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'Well, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets, invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' So those slaves went out into the streets, gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' He was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you. You may be seated. Okay, some more tough sayings by Jesus. It's more difficult. What is going on in this? Who wants to be invited to this wedding party? My golly, the first crowd of guests gets murdered. Their city gets burned down. Well, to get some context here, we got to go back to last Sunday's parable that explored the escalating violence that happens in society and by people that are in power, people that have land and property. And now we come to a king in power who wants to assert his power over an entire town plus more. And we see how this king acts ruthlessly in order to prepare a wedding banquet for people, and then he's going to kick out the one guest who doesn't show up with a wedding cloak because, why? Because he was just dragged in off the street. And now he's going to kick him out. Okay, the parables of Jesus are not a model for our morality. They are a mirror to our reality. The parables. Now, there's other things that can model morality for us, the life of Jesus. But the parables of Jesus are meant to expose the problems in his day and in ours with politics and religion, and are meant to be a mirror to our reality. Let me say it again. The parables of Jesus are not a model of morality. They are a mirror to our reality. I didn't come up with that. I'm just repeating it. These parables are mirrors of reality rather than models for morality, which can free us from the old models of God as a violent, vengeful God who's ready to wipe out his followers just because they don't wear the right type of clothes or don't look the right way in his wedding party. This is a capricious God whom we're familiar with in many contexts of religion, but it is a mistake. And we need to see the parables as a mirror to what can go wrong with religion, what can go wrong with society when there are rulers willing to murder the townspeople just for not showing up to a meal. This king who cares more about crowd sizes than about people's lives. The context for understanding this is right before we read this. Matthew chapter 21 says, "When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them." So this comes just before our reading in chapter 21. It says that Clearly, the chief priests and the Pharisees, the people in charge of the religion of the day, discovered that his parables were mirrors to themselves. They were not models of morality that they should follow. They were actual mirrors that were exposing how they were treating God's people. Clearly, the parables were mirrors to them. And Jesus is denouncing corrupt political authorities and corrupt religion. The actual words of today's parable from the start. It says, once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. The word compared in the Greek means it can be made into. In other words, the kingdom of heaven can be made into this if people of good faith, of good values, of good morals don't take the courage to speak up and stand up and stop this madness, this misinterpretation of God's will. The misinterpretation that wants to throw a party and wants to have a crowd, but is willing to force people to come out to this crowd and expose themselves to a violent dictator who has just killed countless townspeople and has burned down their village. And now he wants to continue a wedding feast. With that kind of attitude, we need to beware, and it takes people of good faith to be wary of what we see in the mirror of Jesus' parables. Last week's parable, like today, had an escalation of violence, a cycle which builds to murderous intensity. The question today is, how violently will the earthly lords, the kings on earth today, the presidents, how violent will they be to control what they believe is God's mandate for them? What kinds of peaceful transitions of power are planned? But more likely than not, we're desperately in need to be thinking about other things. We are overrun by thinking about these things. And so we hear back in the reading from Philippians, think on the things of God that are honorable, just, and pleasing. And as Philippians says, and the God of peace will be with you. So thinking about weddings and wedding parties, let me see what I came up with. Take a little break, a little compassionate break for us to get back into a little bit more subtle mind frame, because the violence can overtake us. The threats of violence and control can overtake us. And so what can we think about? Well, I found this joke that was, it's geared towards people that have been married or who are currently married or understand something about relationships. This joke goes this way. When your wife or husband or significant partner gets a little upset, just remember a simple calm down in a soothing voice is all it takes to get him or her a lot more upset. Calm down, just calm down. Anyway. Oh, okay, here was one more. Arguing with your husband or wife is a lot like trying to read the terms of use on the internet. In the end, you just give up and say, I agree. Okay, I don't know where that one's going.
You know, there are 3 words that can make your marriage last forever.
Please forgive me.
No, 2 words.
Oh, yes?
Yes, dear.
Oh, yes, dear. Okay, one more that's just for silliness, okay? This one is, do you know why the King of Hearts married the Queen of Hearts? They were perfectly suited to one another. Oh, jeez. Okay, I'm going to put those away. And come back to this king and this son the son is trying to have a wedding, and we have this father, this relative, who's ready to to basically disown the whole town in order to get some kind of recognition for himself. The political leaders that Jesus described will stop at nothing to control crowds of protesters. The people that protested going to the wedding are murdered. They're killed. Their houses are destroyed because they protested this king, just like we have other kings in the scriptures and in our own days, which act ruthlessly and out of violence. We have King Herod, who murders all the children in the city. King Herod, when Jesus was born, just to stop a new rumor that a new king was born, he has countless numbers of children killed. Another King Herod is the one who had John the Baptist's head on a platter. Remember that story? That was just because John the Baptist had heard about the divorce and that King Herod had remarried his brother's wife after he had his brother killed. Clearly, if anyone is in the business of killing and would suddenly see themselves in the mirror of Jesus' parable, it's not going to be you. It's going to be these people in power that are going to ruthlessly exert their power over others with violence and control. And the king of this parable, who murders countless citizens during a wedding, is straight out of a dictator's handbook. This murderer who goes beyond any sense of justice takes his wrath out by burning down a whole city, and then in a spirit of forced celebration continues with a wedding feast even though the whole town surrounding him is burning to ashes. The king of this parable is not God. The king of this parable is a mirror to the horrific realities of political leaders committing evil. The violence that Jesus rejects, renounces, and is resurrected from. The parable speaks of people dragged in off the streets. Who are these people? Are these the people that had just had their homes burned to the ground? Perhaps they were the people who had just seen earlier what happened to those who had refused. Oh my gosh, that guy's getting killed for refusing to go into this political party? Well, maybe I'll join just so I can live. This is the most wicked reversal of God's desired rule of the kingdom of heaven on earth. At the hands of kings and the powerful, clearly, here is the quote from Matthew: the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. This is Matthew chapter 11, verse 12. The kingdom of heaven has suffered violence. This is what it's been made into. And the violent have taken it by force. And then into this nightmare of everyday power and violence in worldwide politics, then in walks a single God-sent human. A single person. All of a sudden, the focus of the king's wrath moves from a whole city down to a single man, a scapegoat. But in this one man, we find the heart of Jesus, who is willing to stand up to the violence inflicted by the earthly kings. This one real king of peace, who demonstrates a non-violent resistance by humiliating the king in front of his enslaved audience. Remember, the king owns slaves. The king uses his slaves to hurt others. And now this one person that dares not wear the correct uniform, doesn't wear the right hat at this wedding party, doesn't wear the right wedding gown at this party, is able to humiliate the king in a non-violent resistance by exposing the shame that the king has just wrought on the whole city. This king had just destroyed the whole city and murdered countless people. And so instead of showing up in riches and lavish wealth, this person shows up practically naked to expose the irony and the hyperbole happening. Now, if we remember John the Baptist, who shows up in the wilderness, what kind of clothes did he wear? Right? Not many. He wore a loincloth and sandals. He wore the wrong clothes to the party. Now, when we see Jesus on the cross, what is he wearing? Is he wearing a kingly robe? No, they've stripped it away from him. He is like the person who has shown up to this party of religious leaders and political despots with the wrong clothes on, and he distracts their attention away from the violent murder that they had planned for the whole town. And now Jesus has become the scapegoat. Jesus reminds us how to find God's message of love, of peace, of building people up, even when the kings and the politics and the religion of the day continue to suffer violence and take the kingdom of heaven by force. Today, we are freed from equating God with political powers who use violence, thus freeing us to boldly claim, as the words of Philippians say, the God of peace be with you. This is the message that we hear, the God of peace be with you. That we get to rejoice in the grace that once again God the Father is not like this horrific despotic king, these leaders, these rulers, even the political and religious rulers who have so turned God's message into one of hurt and harm rather than the help and the humility of grace and goodness. So we can rejoice that God our Father is not like this violent king, but is rather like the one who comes to stand up to their shame, who comes as one who shows us the way, the truth, and the life. I'll conclude with a quote from one of my favorite biblical scholars, a quote from Walter Wink. He once said this: "I don't see myself as a pacifist. I see myself rather as a violent person trying to become nonviolent. And by the help of God, by God's grace, we can achieve that in our lives, even if it's just one instance at a time, one step at a time, we can find this grace of God to transform us into the nonviolence, into the love, into the peace of God that surpasses all understanding in Christ Jesus." Amen. Our hymn of the day is "It Is Well With My Soul."